So in chapter 6, we learn about the connection between a person's growth and maturation and the development of their motor skills. So some motor skills are improved because of actual changes in experience and practice with that skill. And sometimes improvements in performance come from just being stronger, bigger, and faster. And that's where growth and maturation plays a part in motor development. So when we measure growth, whether it's height or weight or body proportions, then we can keep up with what's normal growth, so we can identify maybe deviations from normal and possible diseases or deficiencies by doing that. And we can also identify some constraints on motor development. Remember, we've talked about how body size relates to performance of a skill. So that's why we want to pay attention to growth and maturation and understand how a child develops based on those things when we're studying motor development, right? So if you have, like in a typical physical education class, you're going to have kids that are developing normally in their average height and weight. You're going to have kids that are taller than normal, but still haven't caught up to their ability to coordinate these longer limbs, especially if it was a large growth spurt that they just had. You may have kids that are smaller than normal, and so they're not able to perform some skills just because they're smaller. You know, I think about basketball, and a lot of the skill in basketball is just how close you are to the goal. And if you're taller, you don't have to use as much force to get the ball into the goal because you're closer to it, whereas a shorter person has to put a significantly more effort into making that shot. So just be mindful of growth and maturation when planning activities and making sure that they're developmentally appropriate. So the first thing we're going to look at is the different ways to measure growth. And so one of those is height, and you can do this several different ways. The preferred method is stature, and so stature is measuring it from while they're standing, and you measure it from the floor to the vertex of the head, so the top of the head. And but that requires that the person be able to stand. So a lot of times with babies who haven't quite gained that ability, they'll measure recumbent length, where they lay them down on the table, or maybe they can stand but they're still kind of wiggly, so it makes that hard. So they'll lay them down on the table and they'll mark a line at their feet, stretch them out and make sure they're as stretched out as possible, and then make a line at their head, and then they'll get the baby up and measure the different distance between those two lines, and in that way, you know, it's easier with a baby that's wiggly. They don't want to stay still for very long. So if you can get just long enough to pull the legs straight, mark a line, then the legs can go back to wiggling while they draw the line at the head, as long as they're not moving from that spot. So, and then knee height is more used with adults who are maybe disabled or have a hard time standing. And so in that one, you're measuring the distance from the base of the foot to the top of the knee, and you use mathematical formulas to estimate stature from that distance. And so as you can imagine, there's going to be some differences in that. You know, again, with the baby, they're super wiggly, and so they're not going to just lay still. So you may get some error there. Actually, a couple of times when I took my kid to the pediatrician, the doctor would come back in and retry the recumbent measurement to make sure it was right. And, you know, with the knee height measurement, you're estimating that based on the length of the leg. And, you know, some people's body proportions are different. Some people's legs are longer than their trunk, and some people's trunks are longer than their legs. And so that's really just a rough estimate, and you're going to get some differences. So if stature is available, that's what you'd prefer to use. But if not, then you just use the next best option, and then you'll compare that to a normal height chart. And the next thing you want to keep up with is weight. And so with the traditional adult scale, you'll just stand on the scale and it'll give you your poundage or kilograms. And At the doctor, they usually have the sliding scale, which is generally a little more accurate. With babies, they usually have what's called a platform scale, which is shown here, where they get to lay down on in kind of a bed looking thing, and that helps with the fact that when they can't support themselves and they don't want to be still. And you can also, if you don't have a platform scale available, and let's say, there are several things in infancy that require a certain weight requirement. Like when my daughter was little, her swing had a weight requirement, or weight limit, really. Her car seat has a weight requirement. And so sometimes we will want to measure her weight in between going to the pediatrician's office. So what you can do in that case is, if you step on the scale and measure yourself, and then step back on the scale while you're holding your child, and then so that gives you two different numbers, and if you subtract the two, then the difference should be the weight of the child. So then it's not just the growth of height and the growth of weight, but also the tie of those together and the proportions of the different parts of the body as they grow. That makes a difference in motor development. So body mass index, or BMI, is one way to measure body proportion. And so that's a ratio of height to weight. BMI usually gets a bad rep because it's not really a good measure of fat mass. It doesn't really tell you whether you have what percentage of your weight is fat versus muscle, but it has been found to be correlated with disease nonetheless. And so what that tells us is it doesn't really matter whether your weight is all muscle or all fat or somewhere in between. If your weight to height ratio is off and you're classified in the overweight or obese scale, you're still more likely to get disease regardless of whether that's fat mass or muscle mass, just because it's harder for your heart to pump, and it takes more effort and more work to support those tissues. Another thing we look at with babies is their head circumference, and I think we've talked about this before, but when babies are born, their head is 25% of their body. So their head is really relatively huge compared to their body, whereas we kind of grow into our head as we age and as we grow. And so because their head is so big, you'll see that challenges their balance and their development of locomotion. Another proportion we can use is sitting height, and that really tells us the ratio of trunk length to leg length. And so you kind of use, by giving yourself a ratio of the sitting height to the stature measurement, that tells you what percentage that is. And so you can look at averages with that as well.